Hi there. Um, it seems like from your questions and comments on your first response that you're enjoying the Ramayana. Um, I want to go through some of these questions, and I won't hit everybody's, but I want to hit some of them. And some of the questions will come across in the next week or so. The first thing I want to address is the timeline of the Ramayana. Um, there is a story, and you've got to get into this and kind of start seeing the story, right? This is this kind of large, digressive epic. And if you read the real thing, it's even more so, just going off in different directions. But there's this sweeping main story. And I just want to make sure everyone's got that. I think you're starting to probably feel it. Rama is going to be the king as his father retires. He marries Sita. He's going to be king. There's a problem that comes up, and he is now not able to be king. He has to instead go out to the forest and kind of bide his time until he can be king. In the forest, Sita is kidnapped by Ravenna, and then Rama has to figure out where she is and also go rescue her. And then he comes home with Sita, and there's some more events. So that is the arc, the main part of the story. Now, as you're realizing, there's the story of Ganges, and there's all these different things that are happening as well. So you got to kind of filter out some of those subsidiary stories and see that main story. That's what I would recommend, and really hope that as you're reading this, you'll start to feel. Why is it structured like this? Well, it's just very discursive or digressive as a story, and that's just the style. It's an epic, so it aims to treat all kinds of different questions and problems and relationships in life, and it isn't terribly worried about fitting into a 2 or 3 hour movie block. Right, like we expect very linear and plot-driven narratives, and this is just kind of all over the place. And I would just say try your best to kind of enjoy that style. You talk about Viswamitra, the sage, and you ask, are sages smarter than kings? And Viswamitra is a very interesting question, character. And on page 7. So this is the sage who comes and who recognizes Rama and then who takes him out on this trip. And so who is this Viswamitra who comes to the king? He was Viswamitra, once a king, a conqueror, and a dreaded name, until he renounced his kingly role and chose to become a sage, which he accomplished through severe austerities, combined in himself the sage's eminence and the king's authority, and was quick-tempered and positive. Okay, so this is someone who has kind of gone beyond kingship. There's a kind of worldly ruling power that is a king, and then we have these spiritual powers and eminences that are out in the world. And it's worth thinking, like, what is spiritual power based on? In this tradition, it's maybe not the prophet in the form of Amos, who's been given these words to speak, but there's a kind of personal spiritual power, which we see here from Viswamitra, which he accomplished through severe austerities, right? And then if we read down just a little bit, he had complete mastery over his bodily needs through inner discipline and austerities. So there's a pattern I think you'll see is where is spiritual authority grounded in this epic? And I think you'll often see it as being a part of bodily and spiritual practices. And if you think of practices like yoga as it's practiced today, but you can kind of read that back, right? There's a way in which there's a spiritual power that can come from austerity and self-control and bodily control especially, and that there's a basis there for spiritual power. That's nothing, we didn't see anything like that in the portions of the Hebrew Bible that we read, right? That was much more of a revelation, model, and here it's more there's a kind of um, power that resides through control of one's body. And sage isn't being used in any kind of a technical sense, but this is just kind of a spiritually alive and powerful person. Um, Alex, you ask, is this regarded as a highly religious text? Um, what is its use in the Hindu religion? Well, yes, this is a religious text. It's tantamount. It is a scripture in the Hindu tradition, and these the stories are just everywhere in the Hindu tradition. And the related question is, Nathan, when you say, why read this? How does this differ from the Bhagavad Gita? Um, and, the Bhagavad Gita is this narrow sermon within this sprawling epic work. And it's a favorite part of those epic works, and something that, especially in recent century or two, has been something that people really return to and see as the kind of the central portion of um, these epics. But it certainly doesn't take away from the rest of the epics. The epics are these stories, and those stories are just embedded throughout culture. So we'll watch a piece of this popular Indian television program, which is sprawling multi-part series telling the story of the Ramayana. When I went to a very large ancient Hindu temple in Indonesia, you're walking around the base of it, and it has all these pictures that are come from the story, and it's like, oh yeah, this is the Ramayana. You can recognize these things. So I think it does a disservice to these Hindu scriptures to just take out the Bhagavad Gita and say, well, this is all we really need, right? That they're long for a reason, because life is complex, contains lots of different responsibilities and duties, and the epics and places in India. And the epics are a way to treat kind of life on a wide angle lens. Okay. Sort of like reading the Bible. If you go to the Protestant tradition, the book of Romans is super important. And that's a little bit like the Bhagavad Gita. It's this kind of central part, but by no means would any one of these traditions say, well, you can just kind of take that and that's all you need. And I think that one of the great things about reading the Ramayana in our way is in this text that we have, is in a fairly short number of pages, you get a sense of the sweep of the epic and how much was included in these epics. Amy, you ask, Rama, and you note how we don't really get any windows into what his inner thoughts are, or his inner feelings. And Rama is a character. That's what I want to talk about on Wednesday. In some ways, he's frustrating because he's too perfect, and there are problems. He's an ideal person in so many ways, and he can be a little bit off-putting because of that. And this is also ancient literature, right? So some of the kind of interior world that we expect from a modern novel just isn't present in these kind of ancient epics, and that's true for Greek, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are kind of also other examples of ancient epics, and they just aren't contemporary novels in the sense of giving a sense of inner feel. But see what we can learn about Rama as a character. And in fact, that's the question I'd like you all to look for Wednesday, is to look at the episode. It's in the chapter that's entitled Two Promises Revived. And in this section, you get Rama is going to be king, but then Kaikeyi and her servant Kuni decide that, wait a second, there were promises that were made for her son, and that this is unfair, and she brings a demand to the king. What do we learn morally from that story? Okay, I think you'll see that there are a number of different angles to take on this, about how should a king act? What are our duty as a son to a father? Should Kaikeyi have insisted on this promise? What do we think of the character Kuni? Just think of all these characters in that chapter and this incident, and what I want to begin talking about on Wednesday is what is the moral feeling that we get from uh, uh, from this chapter? What are the ethical values that this chapter is communicating to us? All right, and then landscapes. So you all wrote about landscapes, um, and this is yet another example of why you couldn't take the Bhagavad Gita solely on its own. Right, one of the major things that happens in Book of Genesis and Exodus and the Hebrew Bible as a whole is this kind of forging of a relationship between the people, the ancient Israelites, and this place, Jerusalem, and as the promised land, and there's a connection between the people and the place. And lots of places are mentioned, and there's a sense of sacred space that is ultimately being built. Well, and that comes down to our own day, right? We have three Abrahamic religions centered in Jerusalem, and a lot of that is simply the power of sacred space as forged in the Hebrew Bible. Looking at the Ramayana, also, there's a sense in which this is um, uh, lots of different spaces are coming up. The desert, the Ganges, and read that story on the Ganges, and you can cue, numerous PBS specials about the sacred river and ashes being there, and all these rituals, and that ultimately that comes from this story about the Ganges, that's here in the Ramayana. That's what explains is at the heart of its sense of being a sacred river. Um, so, and if you look at a map of the site locations in the Ramayana, it's all over India, right? So these are known places. They're places that are argued over today. The birthplace of Rama in Ayodhya is there's a mosque there, and Hindus think it should be a temple. And there's it's a site of it's a contested site even to this day. This birthplace of Rama. So one of the goals of these epics is to create a sense of belonging to a place, a physical landscape with deserts and rivers and all these different types of things. All right, so that's another thing to note, is that that's one thing that an epic is doing, is tying a people and an identity to a location. All right, so Wednesday we'll be talking about the chapter Two Promises Revived, and look for the ethical connections and ethical messages that are in that chapter. And then, of course, do the reading. We'll talk about the whole thing as well, but that's where we'll start. All right, thanks for your questions, and I will see you on Wednesday. Hey.